Well, we talked about how one of our systems is a 12-volt unswitched system, and we have a 12-volt switched system. So here's the battery underneath the back seat of the thing here, and that was the negative terminal you were looking at. Here's the positive, and there's just one cable goes off the positive here. They got a little pigtail just sitting here, but this goes through the firewall back to the engine compartment, or actually underneath the back here. Let's take a look at that. So here's that cable. It comes directly to the starter motor, which has been removed. It's been up here. And so this goes to the solenoid on the starter, and then through the solenoid, or contacts connected to the solenoid, and then directly to that starter motor. And then you have three other wires that connected to that same point. And so the 12 volts gets distributed through those three wires right there. This one right here with the spade connection on it, that's your starter. Okay, as soon as you hit that, she starts up. And so we're going to need, for the conversion, we're going to need 12 volts in the rear, and we're going to need it in the front. So that's where we're going next.
So all of the wiring for this vehicle, our power source is the battery under the back seat, but it comes from that point to the starter and branches out from there. And so it will then go, there's a connection here to the regulator, and of course they run a line up front, and you can see the wiring right there. It comes up the passenger side of the tunnel, and then the wiring goes where it needs to go. Here's the fuse block, which is right underneath the light switch there, underneath the dash. That's their fuse block. And of course you've got wiring that goes to the steering column. So your turn signals, your wipers, your horn, ignition, all of that. So you can see what things look like at this point in time. So we're going to have to figure out where we're going to take our 12 volt signal from. We want unswitched 12 volts, which we have a line that's coming from the back, originates the battery, goes to where that starter was. We're going to, connect all those cables together. Not going to be at the starting solenoid like it was, but we'll make an attachment point. And then you have a wire that comes directly up to the fuse block. And so we'll take off that. So it's just the same as taking directly off the battery. We'll take it off the battery side of the fuse block. And then we're going to take ignition switched signal, and that will control our power relay, which will then go to our own fuse block and to our own conversion circuits. So just a matter of determining where we want to do that. The other thing that we're going to do is we have to run some wiring front to rear for things that we're going to be doing. And for example, our KSI circuit needs to go from here back to the controller. Our, if you had a front engine, rear wheel drive car, typically the battery, everything would be up front. You don't have to run things front to rear. Unless you have like a split battery pack, then you'd just be running, cabling to the rear. But, in the VW Porsches, we've got, all of your main wirings in the front, and on the Porsche, the battery's under the front, and but your controller is in the back, and our cooling system is in the back for the inverter. That's in the back. So we have to have some wiring that runs front to rear. And you've seen on all of our projects, we're going to add a terminal strip somewhere up front here, and we add one in the rear, and that basically are our termination points front and rear for all of our wiring. So the wiring will run from a front terminal strip to a rear terminal strip, and then it gets distributed at that point. So you need to know how many circuits you're going to need, how many wires are going to run front to rear, all of that. And so it's not difficult, just takes a little bit of forethought. You can see that on this vehicle, other than, your lights, there's no wiring up front. And so we are going to have some control circuitry up front here. We're going to have a battery box up front here. So yeah, we're going to have some wire that that goes from front to rear. And so we'll just follow the stock wiring from front to back, and so it's not a big deal. And that pigtail that's on the positive battery terminal right there, we'll just connect our DC to DC converter. The output will go right to that. Pretty handy, huh? So let me show you what circuits and the number of wires and everything, how we determine what's going to run front to rear. Pretty much have done what we're going to do to the dash. I mean, we had to put the finishing touches on and wiring and all that, but as far as what it's going to look like, so there was a blank right there, and we removed the blank and put a switch. There was another blank right there, if you go back and look at our previous videos. And we had to put a little washer around it because the hole was a little bigger than the switch. But that's all we've changed. We didn't drill any holes. They were already there. And then for our instrumentation, the JLD 404 will go right here next to the radio, just below the dash. We've got our 12-volt gauge right here, and the Curtis 840 display will go right next to it. The little menu switch will go right there. So the mountings are in place. Don't have the 840 display because we don't have the motor and inverter yet. So, and we're going to run the wiring and everything, and then we'll mount the JLD 404 as soon as we get the wiring in place. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We talked a little bit about the wiring. We identified both switched and unswitched 12 volts, both in the dash. Actually, it's right back here. Good location. And wires that were existing that connected right where we needed to connect and aren't connected to anything else. They're not used. So that's beautiful. Then in the back, we have two wires identified. So that one's going to be our switch 12 volts, and this, of course, it comes directly from the battery, and it's unswitched 12 volts. So that's going to allow us to do whatever we want back here. So that part's done. And that's wiring. We don't have to run from front to rear or whatever. It's already in place. And so that's going to make it easy. So let's take a look at what we do need to run from front to rear. So we're talking about what's going to be necessary to run front to rear. And that is dependent on where we locate our components. And so here's a rough layout of what we're going to have with the VW thing. Every vehicle is different. So, but this will give you the idea, okay? So starting from the front and working rearward. So in the front, we're going to have our charge port, our J1772 charge port, which is going to connect to the charger, and the charger is going to be up front also. It's going to be down in that kind of the wheel well area, right in the front, right in the nose of the vehicle. A lot of times we even put the DC to DC converter there. On this one, I think we're going to put the DC to DC converter underneath the back seat, opposite of the battery, the auxiliary battery. So those two items go in front, and then of course you're going to have the front battery pack, which will go in the location where the stock fuel tank went. That'll be our front battery pack. And in our front battery pack, we're going to have our most positive point in our combined battery pack between front and rear. So that's our most positive point. And that goes directly to our main disconnect. And if you look at other videos we've done, we just did one, I think it was last year, maybe earlier this year, of a VW thing. And you'll see very close proximity, okay? Then also up front, we're going to have our electronics. Now, normally, you know, if you're doing like a Karmann Ghia or a bus or, not even the buses so much, but definitely Beetles and Karmann Ghias and so many other cars, most of your American cars, everything, you can put stuff underneath the dash, okay, or behind the dash. Not really conducive on the VW thing. And some of the buses also, the earlier buses, that's just not the way it works out well. So we actually will have a box that will have all of our relays and electronics and so forth in it. And that's where we'll have our KSI safety systems, so forth, will be up in the front of the vehicle under the bonnet. Then kind of moving back, here we are to the dash. We've got our JLU 404, we've got the 12 volt and 840 displays. You've got the ignition, which is, you know, on the steering column. One of those switches we showed you will be a reverse switch. Then moving back, we've got auxiliary battery and our DC to DC converter underneath the back seat. The fuse will probably be under the bonnet. Your rear battery box, which goes right behind the rear seat. And then the shunt, the controller, the main contactor, our throttle, all of that will be on a component board on the firewall, spaced off of the firewall, in the engine compartment, the original engine bay. So you can see engine bay under the rear seat, the dash under the bonnet. So that's the basic layout. So once we have that basic layout, now we're able to say, well, what has to run from where to where? And we're looking at the big picture still, so we're really talking about what needs to run from front to rear. Well, the charger, the output of the charger, of course, like I mentioned, the charge port and the charger will be in close proximity. The front battery pack
we want our charger to go to the opposite side of the disconnect, so that when we, shut off that switch, nothing is connected to our battery. Nothing. And so the charger is going to go directly, the positive side is going to go directly to that opposite side of the disconnect. The negative side is going to be a wire that runs front to back. This is a short run on the positive, but the negative will run to the rear, to the shunt. And it goes on the load side of the shunt, same side as the DC to DC converter input and the KSI. Okay, so that's going to be our largest wire running back, with the exception of the traction cables. Since I mentioned them, let's talk about those. So you're going to have two cables running front to rear, between the battery packs. So like I said, the negative is going to go through the switch to the positive, the rear pack, and then out of the switch, we're going to run to the back also to the main contactor. So we're going to have two cables, one for the charger, which we normally use 6-gauge wire for that, and then we're going to have some other wires, and so let's talk about those. So from the harness that comes with your controller, we're going to have a wiring that goes from the controller to the 840 display. And so there's actually 4 wires, but they're loomed together. And so now that's one item that has to be run to the front. Another is the KSI control circuitry. So that's going to come out of our ignition switch like we talked about in previous videos, and goes through our 3 or more layers of safety, and from there it goes to our KSI relay, which is in the back of the vehicle. Now, we're going to run one wire from a reverse switch. So we're going to have a ignition switched wire go to single pole, single throw switch, and then that's going to go to the reverse relay, which is also on the rear shown here. And that relay, single pole, double throw relay. So when we turn on a reverse switch, it's going to switch this from the default setting of forward, it's going to shift it into reverse. And we also have it set up so that when it does that, it turns on our reverse lights. So you have reverse lights that come on even though you're using electronic reverse. Simple to do. We've shown you that in previous videos. So that's another one that goes to the rear. The other is we've got some wiring that comes from the controller that needs to go forward. And so one of those is the 12-volt control that comes from the controller, and it's used both in conjunction with the menu switch and our economy mode switch. And so, which we actually use for something else, but anyway. So that has to run forward, and then of course the menu and economy mode also. So this is with the Curtis, that's a red with blue. This is a white with red, and that's brown, if I'm remembering correctly. And then the KSI is blue. So we've got 2 cables, one larger wire that's going to go for our charger, goes from the shunt to the charger, and the rest of this, except for the reverse, are part of the harness that comes with our motor controller setup. The other one would be reverse, if I'm not leaving something out. So then everything else, like I said, I did leave something out. There's
2 shunt wires. For the meter. And so we got 2 wires that will go from the shunt in the rear to the front of the car, to the dash, the JLD 404. The rest of these things are in close proximity. So off an ignition switched source, we're going to activate our 12-volt gauge so we can monitor the battery and the DC to DC converter. The rest of these things are in the rear. The throttle will actually be in the rear. We use the stock pedal and cable and all that, so we don't have to mess, the ergonomics and all that stay the same. We activate the cable in the rear. Lots of videos where you can see how all that goes down. You've got wiring that goes from the controller to the main contactor. You've got the line that goes from the motor to the controller, the encoder lines, and then of course the 3 phases. I showed you we already have power in the back, so we're going to use that switched 12 volts in the rear of the car. When you turn on the ignition, it will turn on our fans and the pump for the cooling for the inverter. But all that's in the rear, so the only ones that we have to run front to rear are these. So ones that aren't part of the wiring harness would be, of course, our traction pack and our charger, but then we're going to have reverse and 2 with the shunt. So that's 3. So what we normally do is we run 4 wires. We'll run a 4-conductor wire back, front to back. So that's going to cover those 3 plus 1 extra for something else that you think of later on, or that someone wanted to add. That wire's already been run. So that's the way we do it. Some of them, we run 7 or 8, so we'll use a different wire setup. So like I said, we've got wire it's a 4-conductor, and we'll use that. We've got 7-conductor, 6-conductor, but we have different wires that we'll use for different projects, and we just run that. So we're running 1 cable back, that with multi-conductors in it. And so we're basically, by doing that, we're only running, we usually use the little wires on these, although it depends on the vehicle. Some vehicles don't have enough length or whatever. We'll run separate wires. But this is going to allow us to run that 1 4-conductor wire, the 840 display, that. So it keeps the amount of wire we're running to a minimum. But that's the big picture. That's what I'm going to be doing moving forward. Some of this I can't do. I don't have the wiring harness yet because we don't have the motor and controller yet. Also don't have the charger and the DC to DC converter. So there's a lot of things that I can't do, but there's things I can do. For instance, that 4-conductor line I talked about, I can run that. We can run the reverse wire. Well, the reverse is part of that conductor, never mind. The shunt to the charger we can run, because we know where those things will be located. We're going to wait on that. We do those. I don't like to do them and have them a little long. You don't want it to be short. That'd be a problem. But I don't like to make them long either, and then you have to cut a foot off or something because, I like to do them to the exact length. And if for another reason, I don't like to waste, for one. But the other is, copper cable's kind of pricey nowadays, so don't want to waste it in that regard either. So, I think that's going to be it for right now. As always, send your questions to info@evforyounow.com. Comments, put them below. And any suggestions for future videos, put those below also. Thanks for watching. See you next time.